All right, let's jump right into a foundational 1886 Supreme Court case, Norton v. Shelby County. If you're a law student currently studying constitutional law or, honestly, just someone fascinated by the architecture of government power, this case is an absolute must-know. It asks a pretty profound question. What happens when a government body acts, issues massive amounts of debt, makes all sorts of promises, but then that body is later found to be entirely unconstitutional? Do their actions still actually count? Today, we're going to explore exactly why the Supreme Court drew a hard line in the sand regarding the de facto officer doctrine and the limits of official authority.
Here is the roadmap for today's explainer. We'll be hitting facts and procedural history, de jure versus de facto, precedents and constitutional challenges, ratification and estoppel limits, and wrapping up with the void ab initio doctrine. Let's get going.
Section 1. Facts and Procedural History. The genesis of the railroad bonds.
Okay, to really grasp this legal puzzle, we first need to understand how these disputed railroad bonds even came into existence in the first place. It's a classic story of post-Civil War American infrastructure expansion, local politics, and a really massive legal misstep. Back in March 1867, the Tennessee State Legislature passed an act creating a brand new Board of Commissioners for Shelby County. 2 years later, in March 1869, this board made a huge financial commitment. They subscribed to the stock of the Mississippi River Railroad Company and issued bonds to pay for the whole thing. But the political and legal winds were shifting fast. By May 1870, a new Tennessee Constitution went into effect, bringing with it strict rules on municipal debt. And then the hammer dropped. In early 1871, the Tennessee Supreme Court definitively ruled that the 1867 Act creating the board was completely unconstitutional.
So the core issue kicked off when the state legislature basically tried to abolish the constitutional county court and replace it with their own appointed commissioners. Under the Tennessee Constitution at the time, local government administration was supposed to be handled by a quarterly court, made up of elected justices of the peace. But the state legislature decided they just wanted to bypass this ancient institution altogether. So what did? They passed a law to strip the justices of their power and hand it over to a board of 5 commissioners appointed directly by the governor. The problem is, a state legislature cannot just pass a regular statute to override a clear constitutional mandate. Because the Constitution explicitly demanded a court of electing justices, this new governor-appointed board was illegal from the very second the ink dried on that 1867 act.
Now, the illegitimate board ended up issuing 29 bonds of $1,000 each. These are the specific bonds that a man named Norton, the plaintiff in this case, was trying to collect on. The Board of Commissioners had issued these bonds to the railroad company, and Norton eventually bought them up. But when the legitimate justices regained control of Shelby County, they eventually just stopped paying. Norton sued, demanding the county honor the debt. And that sets up our ultimate showdown. Should the taxpayers of Shelby County really be on the hook for $29,000, which was a staggering sum in the 1800s, issued by a Board of Commissioners that never legally existed?
Section 2. De jure versus de facto. The doctrinal analysis.
This brings us right to the bondholder's main defense, which hinges on the critical legal distinction between by law and in fact. Norton's legal team knew the board was unconstitutional, right? So they had to rely on a different legal theory entirely to save their investment. Let's break it down. A de jure office is one that is perfectly legal, ironclad, created properly by the Constitution or a valid statute. But the law recognizes that sometimes things get a little messy. What if a legally existing office is filled by someone whose election paperwork just had a technical error? We obviously don't want to invalidate every single decision that officer ever made because that would cause total public chaos. This is where the de facto officer doctrine comes in. This doctrine says that if someone is acting under the color of law and the public genuinely believes they are the officer, their acts can still bind the public even if their appointment was technically invalid. So Norton's team argued, look, these commissioners were sitting in the county offices, acting like the government. They were de facto officers. The county has to pay up.
While writing for a unanimous Supreme Court, Justice Stephen Johnson Field delivered what was essentially a knockout blow to that argument. He wrote, "An unconstitutional act is not a law. It creates no office. It is in legal contemplation, as inoperative as though it had never been passed. If an act is unconstitutional, it is entirely null and void. It affords absolutely no protection, it imposes no duties, and, most importantly for this specific case, it creates no office whatsoever."
The court laid down a massive distinction that is absolutely crucial for law students to grasp. Without a legally valid office, the people occupying it are merely usurpers, not de facto officers. The de facto doctrine protects the acts of an invalid officer sitting in a valid office. It does not and cannot protect the acts of a person sitting in a phantom office that was literally invented by an unconstitutional law. Since the Tennessee Constitution only allowed for the elected justices to run the county, the office of the county commissioner never actually existed in the eyes of the law, and you simply cannot be a de facto officer of a non-existent office. It's impossible.
Section 3. Precedents and Constitutional Challenges. Mapping the Court's Evidence.
To back this up, Justice Field pointed to a pretty wild Kentucky case, proving that a legislature cannot simply invent a new court to usurp a constitutional one. In Hildreth v. Mintire, the Kentucky legislature got mad at their state Supreme Court and literally tried to abolish it and replace it with a brand new one. Spoiler alert on that. You definitely can't do that. The new judges took over, acted as a court, issued rulings, the whole shebang. But the real constitutional court held that because the Constitution created them, the legislature's new court was entirely fake. There can be no de facto court of appeals when the constitutional one still legally exists. The Supreme Court applied this exact same logic to Shelby County. The constitutional justices of the peace still existed legally, meaning the commissioners were nothing more than an illegal tribunal.
Norton's legal team, on the other hand, leaned heavily on a Connecticut case called State v. Carroll. That case famously laid out 4 ways someone becomes a de facto officer, ranging from public acquiescence all the way to holding an unconstitutional appointment. But Justice Field meticulously dismantled their reliance on this case. If you look closely at the requirements for all 4 categories, you'll notice a glaring pattern. Every single one of them requires the underlying office to actually exist. Field pointed out that the defect in those examples was always in who sat in the chair, not whether the chair was legally allowed to exist in the first place.
Because the Shelby County Commissioners totally failed that basic requirement of holding a legitimate office, literally none of their acts had legal standing. They were not acting under color of law, they were acting under a void statute that created a completely fictional governing body. They were, in the stark language of the court, usurpers. And when usurpers issue $29,000 in bonds, well, those bonds are essentially just printed on worthless paper.
Section 4. Ratification and estoppel limits. The failed backup plan. Since the original bonds were deemed totally void, the bondholders scrambled for a secondary defense, claiming that the county actually ratified the debt later on. The logic here is, if you can't win on the original action, you try to prove that the legitimate government accepted the deal after the fact. When the legitimate justices finally regained their rightful power, could they just retroactively ratify what the commissioners did? Well, there was a massive hurdle. By May 1870, Tennessee had passed a brand new state constitution, and this new constitution explicitly stated that no county could give credit to a corporation without the assent of 3/4 of the qualified voters. The rule of ratification is super simple. You can only ratify an act if you currently have the power to do the act. Because the legitimate justices didn't have that 3/4 voter approval, they legally couldn't ratify the railroad bonds, even if they wanted to.
And even before that 1870 Constitution dropped, attempts to levy a tax to pay the bonds just completely fell apart. The bondholders tried to point out that in April 1870, right before the new Constitution took effect, the legitimate justices actually met and voted to levy a tax to pay these bonds. Doesn't that count as ratification? Well, the Supreme Court checked the county records and the math just didn't add up. There are 45 justices in Shelby County, meaning 23 were needed for a legal majority to act. On April 11th, only 18 showed up. On April 16th, only 12 showed up. They couldn't even get a quorum. A minority of justices cannot bind the county, so the entire ratification argument completely collapsed.
Section 5. The void ab initio doctrine. The lasting legacy.
Let's wrap up this explainer by looking at why this specific 1886 ruling is still a total cornerstone of constitutional law today. It all comes down to void ab initio, which is Latin for void from the beginning. Norton versus Shelby County really cemented this principle into American jurisprudence. This doctrine dictates that unconstitutional legislation is treated as if it never even happened, offering zero legal cover for any actions taken under it. An unconstitutional law doesn't just die the day a court strikes it down, it is considered to have never possessed a single breath of legal life.
This case is an essential read for law students because it firmly protects the public from the financial fallout of unconstitutional government actions. It tells us that public policy and even the desire to protect innocent third parties, like the folks who bought these bonds, simply cannot override the supreme law of the land. It places a hard ceiling on the de facto officer doctrine.
You absolutely cannot use the excuse of acting under color of law to validate the actions of a phantom government body. Ultimately, this protects taxpayers from being crushed by the debts of usurpers and ensures that the structural boundaries set by a constitution are actually respected.
So, I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought. When a modern legislature passes a controversial law creating a new agency or office, and that law gets struck down years later, what happens to all the regulations, the fines, and the contracts issued in the meantime? Norton versus Shelby County gives us an incredibly powerful, uncompromising answer. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and always keep questioning the limits of power.